Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
And I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We have a very, very special guest today. I'm very excited about this. This is Melissa Nelson, the elected state attorney here in the 4th Judicial Circuit. Thank you, Melissa, for joining us. You have a very, 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 very important job in our judicial circuit in the state. And the fact that you take time out, which you always do for us, I just can't thank you enough and appreciate your commitment to cold cases, to victims, and specifically Project Cold Case, and coming out here and joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me here today, Ryan. Thank you.
A lot of times people don't know kind of the behind the scenes stories, which I find interesting. So when we do these Facebook Lives, I like to tell people a little bit about how we got to know each other, how it is that you came to sit here in our office today. I think it's important, and I think that families out there, when they see that we have a connection with you, that we have a voice with your office,
absolutely,
it's important to them, and they know that we're not just a bunch of fluff, that we can actually talk to people that can make a difference, and that really have the information on their loved one's case. It's people that actually know things instead of just speculation. A lot of times, especially in cold cases, unsolved cases, we don't have the information as the survivors, as the victim's family, and sometimes for very good reason, that information has to be held back. But we start to speculate and make things up in our head, and that can be dangerous, and it can create false narratives and false facts. Right. And so, when I have an opportunity to talk to a family, and then I can go to you or to the sheriff's office or your office and have real conversations, and come back and assure families that everything is being done or has been done, that the case has been brought up to standards, that a prosecutor has looked at it. It obviously gives some validity to our organization, but the families know that somebody does care, and that has always been at the very base of what we are doing and the foundation of our organization, to let families know that someone else does care. So with that being said, you were elected to state attorney 2 years ago now, January?
Over 2 years ago.
Just over 2 years ago. And I had never met you. Didn't know you at all. You didn't know me. But I have always felt that I was doing good in the city of Jacksonville, and this organization was a benefit to the city. And so I just say, anybody that's elected in Jacksonville, I'm going to reach out to them, and I'm going to let them know what I'm doing, because I think it's important that they understand, they have an ally, that's somebody, out here, a commoner that's fighting for the same things. So I mailed a letter to your office, and you were kind enough to read the letter and then respond, and set up a meeting. And probably one of the things that you don't know is I already had a lot of friends that worked at the state attorney's office as prosecutors and advocates. And I got a call from one of them that said, why is Melissa Nelson requesting your dad's file? And I said, probably because I sent her a letter and told her who I was.
It wasn't because of your letter.
No.
Coincidentally, an article ran in the newspaper about you and your father's case. Was it the Daily Record, or was it to you?
Yeah, it was the Daily Record, I think.
So, and an article ran, and I was curious about it, and either a couple days before or a couple days after, I received a letter from you. So when I saw your signature on the letter, I thought, oh my gosh. So you had to write me immediately after, because I was familiar with the story. And
stories like that, again, it kind of just emphasizes I know we're doing good work
You
here.
are
We're doing
good
it
work.
for the right reasons,
Important work.
and why both of those things would cross your desk at the same time, kind of
Serendipity.
making sure that you know that we exist. And we had a meeting in your office, and I'll never forget Tim Quick, who was our guest last week, was sat in on the meeting with us. And I tell people this all the time, that at the end of the meeting, you held up this sheet of paper that was an Excel spreadsheet with just, a bunch of stuff on it. And you said, this is my to-do list for my first year in office. And you said, cold cases is not on here, but as soon as you walk out the door, we're going to add it. I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to do something, and we're going to partner up, and we're going to make this a priority. And, for somebody like me who, there's no reason you should have accepted that meeting invite and that we should have been there. Like, that was meaningful and powerful for me. And then you followed up on it and you followed through with it. And within no time, I had an office in your building and access to the investigators. And you started working on a cold case initiative. And I'll let you talk about it more, but it's an opportunity for your attorneys and prosecutors to review cases almost voluntarily, right?
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about it.
So I've, first of all, thank you for having me today.
Sure.
And thank you. I mean this, I always tell you this, but thank you for what you're doing. I know you have a shared experience with everybody you help by virtue of your father's homicide, but what you're doing makes a difference.
Thank you.
And so the cold case initiative, when I was a trial prosecutor, I had the opportunity to work on cold cases, and I always thought they were fascinating. Science changes, and the tools that we have at our disposal to use to investigate crimes changes and evolves. And so I've always been personally interested in cold cases, and I think being able to give a family an answer to a question that they hold on to every minute of their lives is particularly gratifying if you're in law enforcement. And so we know we have a bunch of cold cases, and I thought, how could we do something that would be meaningful? And obviously I have to think about resources all of the time. So what we thought is we would develop an initiative that, to your point about it being voluntary, we thought, okay, any prosecutor in the office, even a brand new prosecutor who's assigned to misdemeanor court, hasn't yet been put on the homicide rotation. They still have an analytical mind, and they're a new set of eyes. And so if they wanted to spend extra time in looking at a case, it would be beneficial to both parties, families of loved ones, and the state, and to the lawyer themselves, because they would learn. And I feel that we will likely have success if we solve one. That will only begin a cycle of, obviously that will be celebrated. It will encourage other people to participate in this. Our thinking is we've assigned one of our most talented homicide prosecutors to oversee the initiative. She's read best practices on how to take a population of cases and triage them, make quick decisions about if a case is the solvability factors, essentially, for moving forward. And right now she's been creating essentially the database with help from you all about the body of cases. So we're plodding along more slowly than I'd like, but moving forward.
Hey, we're still moving forward, and I think this is a unique initiative. Something that people may not understand is that in your position, you normally don't get involved until an arrest is made.
Correct.
You're prosecuting these criminals.
And what happens is we often work hand in glove with our law enforcement partners on homicides. But we, like any other business, have attrition. So lawyers retire, or lawyers take a job in the private sector and they leave. And we were not indexing or tracking what happened to that lawyer's set of cold cases. So when I left, for example, the state attorney's office, I think there were 3 in my office. They weren't reassigned to anybody because they're not a pending case for which there is a pending court date and we've got to send somebody to show up. And the other thing about cold cases, as you know better than most people, Having somebody invested, a detective, a prosecutor, when that investment or that personal interest leaves, those cases can languish.
Sure, absolutely.
So one of the things that London is doing is actually inventorying what do we have in the state attorney's office right now that's not on our, because they're not pending cases. What's the universe of cases? And then reassigning those cases to our lawyers in the office.
And you're right. I remember it clearly, being contacted by an assistant state attorney when my dad was murdered. And
do you remember who that was?
Yeah, Kristen Lucart. She's not there anymore.
Yes, I know
but
Kristen
she was assigned to my dad's case. I believe she went to the scene, which is something that your office does when a homicide occurs. Whoever's on the rotation, the prosecutor, is on call basically, and if a homicide happens, they go out to the scene and are there from start, hopefully, until finish, assuming there's an arrest made quickly and that so forth. But I remember her reaching out, getting a letter, talking to her on the phone, and then like you said, and something that your office and all state attorney's office, district attorney's offices struggle with is a lot of attorneys come out of school and get jobs with the public defender or the state attorney's office, and then they find that they can make a lot more money in the private sector. Hey, you had a little stint in the private sector, didn't you? It's such a draw. It can be a struggle to be a young attorney with a mountain of debt coming out of college, and you want to do right working at the state attorney's office or public defender's office, but that can be a struggle for a young family. So a lot of them end up taking a job in the private sector. And there's really something to be said for those that have kind of stuck through the Londons of the world.
Certainly.
And stayed on it. But you're right. Kristen Lucart left. She got a job at a private firm. I still talk to her occasionally. I've run into her at restaurants around town. But she's not at the state attorney's office anymore. So my dad's case probably, did not get reassigned to anyone when she left. There was no need to or no reason to. There was no arrest imminent. No
That's why
trial.
What you're doing is so important too, because you can act as the liaison and the continuing point of contact for multiple families when they want to know what's going on with this case. Is anybody looking at the case?
Well,
when's the last time somebody cracked the file? Is there something we should know? And
it's interesting because with technology moving at the rate that it is right now, look, these cases are cold for a reason. The more and more I get into this and the more I look at these cases, it's not because of shoddy detective work or, what I mean? These cases are cold for a reason. Sometimes who did it, but you simply don't have enough proof and evidence. And that's, as frustrating as that is for families, I know that that's frustrating for your office. And that's kind of why we need the community's help. If you already know who committed a crime, but you're lacking some part of evidence to be able to prove it in court, it literally could be one person that gives you that.
That's absolutely right.
And so it's important that we all work together on that. And I lost my train of thought on somewhere else I was going with that, but it just working together with the community and providing that and technology. We can take a case that hasn't been looked at in 5 or 10 or 15 years, and if nothing else, bring it up to current investigative standards. Right. And that should be important enough. We're not going to solve every single one of these, but if every few years the opportunity presents itself to bring it up to the current standards, and we know that it's been tested with the newest technology.
And give families absolutely the peace of mind that the investigation has been brought up to today's standards, and that we've availed ourselves to all the science currently available to us to test everything that there might be.
Right, and that fresh set of eyes sometimes.
I definitely know there's value in that.
Yeah, and that's sometimes a hard sell, because you're limited on resources. We're all limited on resources, specifically financial resources, and so sometimes testing can be expensive for the newest technology. Sometimes assigning a specific unit, whether it's a sheriff's office having a dedicated cold case unit or just having homicide detectives that occasionally can go pull an old file. And then the same with your office where, this is, again, you've taken on a responsibility that isn't something normally taken on within a state attorney's office. And so I can't overstate enough how impressed I am by that and how excited I am by that and how I hope that spreads and other state attorneys' offices will take a look at what you've done and say, hey, look, this is working.
Well, once we can put some success on the board, hopefully that will happen.
And we're getting there, One of the cases that your office recently prosecuted was the murder of Tammy Welch. And we did a Facebook Live on that case. And that was a 1984 case or 80. It was. Yes. It took a long time to get there, but between your office, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, and the NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, nobody ever gave up on that case. Yeah. There were times the family had no idea that you guys were closing in on a suspect, had identified a suspect, and then ultimately arrested a suspect. And it took a while to get that one to trial, but that was just last year. November was the guilt phase, and then December was the penalty phase. And I got to know Mr. Welch very well during that time. And I remember when it was impact statement time, looking back and seeing you in the courtroom. You can't be at every trial for the entire length of a trial, but you make an effort to go in there specifically when the victims are speaking. And I try to. Nobody's ever said like that, you have to do that. That's your job, But I've noticed, because those are the things that I notice, and I don't get to be in the courtroom as much anymore because now I'm dealing with the cold cases. But I was in another resentencing hearing for the Maddie Clifton case, which is obviously not an unsolved case, not a cold case. But I've grown close to Maddie's mom over the years, and so I wanted to be there for them while they went through the resentencing hearing, and you were there for that. And not only that, but when it was time to kind of walk out of the courtroom, you pulled the family into the little side conference room and sat down with the family. And I know that was important to them and meant a lot to them. And again, as an outsider seeing your commitment to victims, it just I know you're in the place you're supposed to be, and you're doing the good that this city specifically, could use. I mean, there's a lot of violence here. We're a big city. We have our fair share of murders and violent crimes. And so again, for the people that don't know you, and I like to offer a little glimpse into what I see when I do run into you,
Well, I certainly feel like I am where I'm supposed to be. I love working at the state attorney's office, and I feel like, having not been ever in the shoes of a crime victim, that frankly the criminal justice process has got to be very unsatisfying and frustrating for victims. And so when victims give their impact statements, that's the one small segment of time in a terrible journey for families where they get to speak from their heart about their loved ones. And so I've always, as a young lawyer and now as the elected, find that those are the most compelling moments in the courtroom. I've always felt that way.
They are, and it means something to these victims that you take your time out of obviously a very important job and a very busy schedule to come in there and step in and be a part of that. It's again, it's not necessarily on your job description. You don't have to do that. That's a choice that you make, and it is recognized. We also sit on a statewide cold case advisory commission.
Well, I'm on it, I think, because of you.
Well, it's funny. I was looking for an email the other day and from the Cold Case Advisory Commission, and I found this email that I had sent to the chair, Sheriff Sadie Darnell, and I said, hey, we had this big discussion at our last meeting about needing a state attorney on the commission. We have this newly elected state attorney in this circuit, Melissa Nelson. She's already shown a commitment to cold cases. We've had meetings together. I'm confident that she's exactly what we need on this commission as that unique perspective. I mean, we had this whole meeting with a lot of detectives and investigators and some medical examiners and some forensic scientists and DNA analysts and myself, and there was no one from the prosecutorial side and perspective to help us understand what your struggles are and your office's struggles with these cases. And the reply I got back was basically, we will reach out. Can you give us her, contact information? And then I completely forgot about that. And then the next thing I knew, we were at a meeting and they were like, oh, and we have a new member, State Attorney Melissa Nelson. And I was like, wonderful. But we had our last meeting was down in Gainesville, and you were there. And again, there's a lot of people at those tables that offer unique perspectives that are important in the process. And we've had a number of cases presented to us when we review cases quarterly that are, I know who did this, but I don't have enough evidence. And so that's something that we don't really talk about a lot of, but that's a reality. I mean, you can't take somebody to trial if you can't prove that they did it.
Right.
Even if you believe it in your heart and your gut, you know what I mean? And you have some evidence, that's maybe circumstantial or, leading that way.
We have an ethical obligation, actually, that before we can institute charges, we have to believe, and obviously there's some subjectivity to this, but that we have a reasonable probability of conviction.
Right.
It's a very high standard, and that's based on beyond a reasonable doubt.
And let's talk about that. If you indict somebody and you're going to charge them with a murder, and you would never, there's no justice in convicting the wrong individual. First of all,
absolutely.
So, and I can promise you that there's not a family out there that wants the wrong person held accountable. There wouldn't be accountability.
Absolutely.
But beyond that, if you do get that case to trial and you believe that that's the person, but there maybe is evidence that's lacking or that is too circumstantial in certain cases, and they're acquitted, that's it.
That's it.
You don't ever get the opportunity when somebody comes forward the next day and says, well, I knew, I was with them.
That's right. So
game over. You don't get that opportunity.
This is important in every case that we prosecute, charge, and indict, but in particularly, it's important in cold cases to strategically, when you pull the trigger, that you have all your ducks in a row, because you're exactly right. You are barred by double jeopardy from ever pursuing that case again, should you in fact obtain incriminating evidence later. And so that's why, especially on cold cases, that it's important that we have confidence that we've done everything we can and we have the full body of proof, and there's not something else out there, another stone we should turn over before we institute charging. And
I know it can be frustrating for families that they believe they know, or they, the law is very different than, the dining room table or the living room. We can talk about things even here in this office, but they don't always apply to the law, which is what you have to follow, which is what your office is in charge of, and so, it's why we openly invite families to ask us questions, to have meetings with you and your staff and your assistant state attorneys to answer those questions. I know when I was going through this early on, and it was never an issue of prosecution because there was never even a suspect, but I remember that sometimes I just needed somebody to sit me down and tell me exactly how it was.
So I believe, I completely wholeheartedly agree, and I think one of the things that we try to do and we do well is to sit down with families and actually explain where we are, and that's on cases in which we can proceed, and that's on cases where we can't proceed. So sometimes even when we're delivering news that is not what a victim's family wants to hear, I think it's important to be very transparent about how we came to a decision. One of the things that I've done in the last 2 years is every single homicide, as you mentioned, we have a homicide rotation, so our lawyers go out to the scene and they are assigned the investigation and the follow-up prosecution if there is prosecution. But I send a letter on my letterhead to every single family of a homicide offering a meeting should the family want it, in addition to whatever meetings they're having with law enforcement and the prosecutor assigned, just so the family knows that I have an open door, and if they're unpleased with something or if they have a question that hasn't been answered, that they can come to me and sit down with me, and I'll make sure that if I don't have the answers then, that we'll get them.
Right. And it's a tough spot to be in, especially when you're not giving good news. I mean, every detective and every prosecutor wants to be in that room when you say we're making an arrest and we're, and getting that conviction. That's great, but it is a very tough thing to be that prosecutor or that detective and have to tell a family we can't do that.
But I think most people appreciate candor.
But they do, and it's not always what we want to hear. But it's sometimes what we need to hear, and it gives us information to be able to heal and move forward. And as long as you're not getting that communication back and forth, there's false hope, there's assumptions, and so it really is important. And I don't take it lightly. I mean, when the detective on my dad's case called me out of the blue after almost a year and a half, and he said, "Hey, can you meet for lunch?" I thought they had something. I thought there was good news, and I couldn't wait for that meeting. And we had to schedule it like a week out, and I was, what could it be? They're going to tell me something. They've identified a suspect, and we went to a restaurant, and we sat down, and he said, I really don't want to tell you this, but we have administratively suspended your dad's case. I mean, I started tearing up in a restaurant full of people, overcome with emotion, because I had been so focused on the fact that they hadn't caught him that it had never dawned on me that they might stop looking, that they may run out of leads, run out of evidence, run out of tips. It was a very, very hard moment, but I needed to hear that because I needed to understand that it had never dawned on me that there are, in certain investigations, there are times where you run out of places to look. You can't just go to every single door and knock on it in this city trying to manufacture a lead or a tip. Sometimes that evidence doesn't point anywhere. Sometimes those tips run out. Sometimes the case goes cold. And, maybe it's a disservice by television shows and production companies, but we never believe that there's a point where a case really does get folded up and put it to the side until something new comes in. But that was the important part. If something new ever came in, if a tip, if a lead, if somebody grew a conscience or changed their mind, that investigation immediately starts back up.
That's right.
But I never thought of that before, that there comes a point where an investigation does stop. And so that was very hard for me at that moment, but I appreciated it later because there was no false hope. There was none of me assuming that they were doing something that they weren't. And, I hear from a lot of families that, I haven't heard from the detectives in a long time. And, this isn't always local, but, we help families all over the country and all over the state. And sometimes they have not had that conversation that a case has been suspended or whatever their jurisdiction calls it. And they are under the assumption that, and a detective is out there working hard trying to dig into a case. And for whatever reason, because a detective transferred, because somebody didn't want to take on that tough conversation, there's a lot of reasons why it could happen or not happen. And sometimes it doesn't. And unfortunately, these families are left with assumptions that something's being
Right.
done and it's not. And you know, we always tell these families, like, that's why it's important that, you know, you share information with us, that we can share information, that we use social media, because if that case is cold, all it takes is one phone call
That's
to make it
right.
hot again.
And I have said this for years. This is true in medicine. Like, I think we have to be our own best advocates,
Yeah.
and certainly it's true as it relates to cold cases as well.
And
But you said something a long time ago that really it stuck with me, and it was something I had not considered. That, you know, the justice system is foreign to a lot of people, and it can be very imposing, and it can be it can be really scary.
Yeah.
And so some people don't know where to start to get information, and they don't know how to navigate the system. And so that's why your organization serves such a valuable function, because they can come to you and you do know how to
Yeah.
advocate on behalf of families, liaise, and provide information both ways.
Yeah. Well, and it's, I kind of pride myself on being a logical person and trying to take the emotion. It's hard to do with my dad's case sometimes, but I can take the emotion out of it, and which is something your office has to deal with, something that detectives in the sheriff's office, police departments have to deal with. It's taking the emotion out of it. But, you know, specifically with the criminal justice system, it's easy to forget that we have a constitution that was written to protect the innocent. And sometimes, you know, it's not an innocent person that still gets those protections because they are innocent until proven guilty. These are all words that we've heard our entire lives. But sometimes we don't like it when it's the bad guy that hurt our loved one, and we hear a lot of times that the defendant has all the rights. But that is the system that we have, which is probably the best in the world.
I believe it is.
The Constitution was written to make sure that innocent people were not, you know, prosecuted.
To be a limit on government authority and government overreach and government power. And so we have to adhere every single day to the rule of law.
Right.
And abide by the constitutional principles. And the reason we have to, not only is it the law, but so that we have credibility when we do institute prosecution against an accused and bring charges against a defendant.
Yeah. It's a difficult and
But
it's
it's difficult
important
for certainly for victims to understand, and the system is set up in an adversarial way so that it certainly seems from the outside looking in and from a victim's perspective that everything is geared in favor of the
Right.
accused. And that's when I say it's got to be a very unsatisfying journey and system. It gives very little to victims of crime until the very end, when they
Right.
have that one moment in time. If the government is successful in obtaining a conviction,
Sure.
because if we aren't, they even lose that.
Right.
But to say their piece.
Right. But it is, I mean, that is the system, and it is the best system out there. And, you know, and that's can be hard for a victim's family to
Lots
swallow.
of ways where
but,
we can improve, though.
Well, but it is important for us to remember that we want a system that people are innocent until proven guilty.
I do.
Because in another system, we've seen how that works in other places in the world. Clint, you said there's a question?
There's a couple, actually.
Okay.
Stephen Madonna.
Let's see. Melissa, if you believe the sheriff's office for your county isn't doing enough or maybe covering something up, is there any way to get different eyes on a certain cold case? This is not local. This is not a local guy, but he, we get this question a lot, and it's sometimes, not.
So I haven't been in a situation where we've had a case where we believe law enforcement is covering something up. But the answer is, if we were in that situation, if there was a case, we have been in situations where we don't see eye to eye on cases.
Sure.
And in that case, we can always take a different look, another look, and an independent look at a case.
So your office is also in charge of prosecuting law enforcement if they
Yes.
stray.
Yes, and we
So you
have
are
an
an
investigative
independent-
staff.
Right.
Sworn law enforcement officers. So we try very, very hard to work collaboratively, because I think that's more efficient. Sharing information is better for everyone involved, and we don't want to trip on each other. But in the event that we saw something differently, or in a very unfortunate event where we were in a case where we felt something was being overlooked, we could definitely put independent eyes.
So, and we get this a lot. This was something that scared me at first when I started Project Cold Case. Was we got our first, the police were involved, and I thought, oh my gosh, I never considered that law enforcement could have been involved and covered up. And then we got a second one, and then we got a third one, and then we got a fourth one, and then we got a fifth one, and I started to realize that these are sometimes our mind. And I'm not saying anything about this specific case because I don't know which one Steven's talking about. I do, but I don't know the details of it. But when we start to assume things and we start to try to find answers where we don't have information, sometimes our mind goes to a place where, what is logical? Well, if they can't make an arrest, it's because they're protecting one of their own, or because the suspect is related to law enforcement or a judge. We get all kinds of stuff. And what we have found is that a lot of times it really is mind playing, a trick on us and leading us down a path that does make sense, except when you have all the information. And when you have all the information, it wasn't necessarily law enforcement not doing a good job or covering up. I tell people now, especially now, it would be so hard to conspire and or cover up a murder. Because like we said earlier, you're sending somebody from your office to the crime scene. So not only does a detective, and detectives don't work one person. So you have to convince your entire team, your sergeant, the state attorney, assistant state attorney that's come out there. It would be very, very hard. And I'm not saying it hasn't happened in the past. I'm just saying that it would be very, very hard to pull something like that off.
I haven't had the experience.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm not saying it hadn't happened, but a lot of cases we get where it's a lot of frustration and anger that they're not getting communication and information, and we know that sometimes they can't get that information. You can take that down, Clint. So we had one person comment about getting in touch with your office if they haven't heard from a prosecutor. Like we said earlier, there's a lot of reasons why somebody may not have
So on
have
a cold
heard from
case or a
somebody.
pending?
So this is I don't know if it's cold. It's a couple years old. Did you say it's 2015?
Okay.
So I don't know if JSO has officially suspended that case.
Well, anybody who wants information on a case can contact our office. My assistant is Cindy Cribb, so she's easy to get a hold of.
And I have all these contact information,
yes.
so if anybody wants to reach out to me.
Absolutely. And if there's a situation where we're limited in what we can share, then I'm also honest about that. In many cases, we're not limited in what we can share. It's just there hasn't been an update. So I continue to say this, and I mean it. I am everyone's servant. So our office is open, and we will respond to you, and I'll get the information that somebody is looking for.
I'm real big on not looking back as much as what can I do today and moving forward. And when we're dealing with cold cases, sometimes evidence collection techniques from the 70s and 80s, you know what I mean? Like it makes it hard today, the way things were done in the past. And you can spend a lot of time angry and mad that things were done differently in the past, but it really doesn't get us anywhere, So when we're working with families, a lot of times our goal is, all right, vent to me all of your frustrations and anger, and then let's start now from here, and let's see what we can do moving forward. So what can we do moving forward?
I think that's a great attitude, but I could certainly understand people's frustration in learning that things weren't collected or stored properly or missed.
Yeah. It is very frustrating, especially when now if that crime had happened today, it probably wouldn't be 40 years cold. Right. You know what I mean? But again, we didn't know DNA could be used in a criminal case in 1981. You know what I mean? In the 70s.
10 years ago, we didn't have touch DNA.
Exactly. So a lot of times they were doing the best they could with what they had. And sometimes they weren't. Sometimes, they missed things. Those are things that we all have to overcome and deal with.
I have found, just in my personal experience, that the people who do this work, the detectives who are assigned in homicide, the prosecutors who work homicides, they are committed people, and they want nothing more than to find the truth in these cases.
To think that they want to be, the root of that anger. I mean, the investigators didn't cause this. There is somebody to be mad at, but when there's no one to point that finger at, a lot of times investigators or prosecutors kind of fall into those crosshairs because you are somebody that they can physically, point at and be mad at. And that's not always right. You know what I mean? And so we want to get to a point. It is. I mean, that's part of your job. And it's not really in the job description, but you knew that getting in, that there's going to be people mad at you.
I woke up this morning and that was true today.
But I think these kinds of relationships, this kind of dialogue, and that open door policy, you're going to see a lot less of that. If somebody's watching and they want to have a meeting with your office, if they, everybody pretty much knows how to get in touch with me. They can reach out to this office and get in touch with me, and I will make sure to pass that information on to you and to your staff so that the appropriate person can reach out to them and answer their questions. And I would just ask the families, remember that sometimes it's changing of jobs. Somebody may have moved on. That let's start from that point. When we get that meeting set, have your moments to vent and express your frustration, because that's important for the new prosecutor, or for the prosecutor or the detective to understand where you're coming from. But I've learned that if we stay in that anger and finger pointing, then it's hard for anybody to get anything accomplished. And we have to come to a point where we're ready to say, what can we do today to move this case forward?
Advance the ball, right?
Yeah. And so I hope we can do that. I know you have another meeting coming up, and so I don't want you to be late for that.
I really appreciate this. This is fun.
Thank you so much for coming. I mean, again, Facebook Live, this was not a formal thing, but this was an opportunity.
It's a great way to have a meeting.
It's a great way to have a meeting and to share what sometimes goes on, outside of the public view. You and I have met on a number of occasions. We talk, these conversations can be public. People can understand that we can have these conversations. And you said something a minute ago about not always seeing eye to eye. We've pretty much always agreed on things, but there I'm sure there will be a time where there might be something that we disagree on, but that's not going to affect our big picture goal, which is always helping victims and moving forward. And I think that's something that carries, with detectives, with your office, with victims and families. I don't always see eye to eye with the victims' families either, but we do have a common goal. And that's what I wanted to be able to share today, was that you share that goal, that we're going to work together to resolve cold cases, to at best or at worst bring them up to the current investigative standards and put new eyes on them. And at best, we're going to solve a few of these and create something that people all over the country are going to want to mirror.
It's very exciting.
It is. And
I'm
thank you,
optimistic.
Melissa, for
Thank
everything
you.
you do.
Thank you, Ryan.
For your commitment to Duval, Clay, and Nassau counties and the people in these counties.
Thank you for your commitment to all of these people and their families.
Well, again, common goal. So
That's right.
Thank you very much, Melissa.
Thank you.
We'll have you on again.
Okay.
With a solved case, hopefully.
Okay.
Right?
Great.
All right. Thank you.
All right.